What's up everybody? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Mike. Now if you guys are like me, you're probably scrolling through photos online and you're seeing all of these absolutely beautiful sunrise photos. But for some reason when you look at your own, you don't feel like you're making that same type of impact. We need to stop right now and figure out what is not working with our landscape photography photos. For the longest time, I would just simply decide the night before to go out for sunrise, hope for the best. But the results weren't very good. It wasn't until I started applying some very basic principles that I started to see my sunrise photos improve dramatically. So what I want to do is give you guys 5 of my favorite tips that will help take your photography to the next level. Tip number 1, wake up early. Give yourself plenty of time to get to your location. I usually arrive at the location at least an hour before sunrise. There's nothing worse than arriving late and having to hurry and rush to take a photo. I always make sure that I have enough time to get in first breakfast.
We've had one, yes. What about second breakfast?
Then lots of caffeine, and then get to the trailhead if I'm hiking. Now you want to make sure to bring a headlamp, or as my British friends say, a torch. Make sure your camera bag is ready and inspected the night before. Make sure you know what time sunrise is, and if you have any hiking, make sure you compensate for that as well. I can't tell you how many times that I got to a location, didn't give myself enough time, was rushing around, and ended up with a photo that I wasn't happy with because I just wasn't prepared and ready. Tip number 2, scout your location. Scouting is such a big part of landscape photography, even more important when you're going out for sunrise. Becoming familiar with the location and the terrain is absolutely crucial. If it's possible, go the day before. Walk around and use your phone to take images and explore different possibilities. Mark them on your Google Maps or your GPS. I have so many locations marked on my Google Maps for this specific purpose. I usually put labels and notes at all of my markers, what type of day would be best and what type of conditions would be ideal for all of my possibilities. This is a big step because you're gonna have to find these locations again in the dark. If you're on a long distance trip and you can't get to your location and scout the day before, first chat with local photographers. A lot of times people will give you good directions or even general locations of places to explore. Also, use tools like Google Earth. See what the landscape and the terrain look like. Combine that with apps like Photo Pills. You can plan ahead to see where the sun will be rising so that you can decide on what type of photo you want to take. Are you going to be facing towards the sun? Do you want to face directly away from the sun? Or will we be getting that nice side light? These are decisions you have to make when you're going out, and if you're doing some scouting, you're going to be able to understand what light works best, which direction you want to face, and all of this in the dark. Tip number 3, understand the clouds. Landscape photography is entirely reliant on the conditions. It is important that you understand the conditions that are needed to predict things like colorful skies or fog or cloud inversions or even thunderstorms. For colorful skies, like we get a lot here in Arizona, you need a certain type of cloud. The ideal type of cloud for this is high altitude cirrus clouds, or as I call them, the wispy clouds. You want 80 to 90% high altitude cloud cover in your area. You don't want these lower altitude or thicker clouds that are gonna block the light and the sun. The light won't be able to penetrate these type of clouds, so you won't be able to get those colorful skies. What you want is about 100 miles away in the direction of the sun. You either want clear skies or more high altitude clouds. Now, I use an amazing app called Meteor Blue. I talk about this in another video. It's an essential app for me when trying to figure out if I'm gonna get conditions that are perfect for colorful skies. Now, this app is great for showing cloud cover, cloud altitude, and even satellite views to show the cloud movement. The key is you want to understand what the weather and conditions are going to be like before you go out to shoot. Tip number 4, use manual white balance. Now, hear me out on this one. This is specific to photographing those colorful skies. When you use auto white balance, generally the camera does a pretty good job of getting it right. But in my experience, putting your white balance setting to manual or Kelvin in most cameras, you can manually set the white balance to match what you're looking at out in the field. This for me, especially during colorful skies, is much more accurate. When everything is lighting up and that sky is on fire, your camera auto white balance tends to go a bit crazy, and it will overcompensate for all of that red by exposing it very blue. Now, I'm sure some of you are saying right now, I shoot raw, so it doesn't really matter. I can fix it later on in post-processing. This is true, sort of. There's one big problem with this, however. You see, colors have luminosity values. This affects your exposure. That's right, warmer colors have higher luminosity values. Cooler colors have lower luminosity values. So let's take a scenario. Let's say the sky is going crazy with just red and orange, this beautiful, colorful sky. The landscape is very dark because the sun is still below the horizon. So you have some really dark shadows and the sky is very bright. The scene has a very wide dynamic range. If you don't want to overexpose your highlights, but you also want to capture all of that shadow detail in the foreground, you have to make your histogram pushed all the way over to the right, which means exposing as bright as possible without blowing out or overexposing that sky. And with your camera white balance in auto, because of that red color, it's going to expose slightly blue, which is going to lower that exposure just a little bit. Now, when you go to fix this in post-processing, if I warm up the white balance back to normal, what it does is it slightly raises that exposure. And what happens is you run the risk of overexposing those highlights when you're making this adjustment. I've always gotten into the habit of using manual Kelvin white balance all the time, not just for colorful skies, but every time I go out to shoot, I am always using manual white balance. For me, what I want is the most accurate file to work with in post-processing. I want to have as much information as possible. This will give me the most amount of wiggle room to make adjustments later on in post-processing with shadows and highlights and color and contrast. So having everything right in camera for the perfect file to work with later in post-processing is extremely important to me. Tip number 5. Take multiple exposures. Taking multiple exposures can help, especially when shooting into the sun. This is also called exposure bracketing. What you'll need to do is take multiple exposures at different values to make sure that the entire dynamic range of a scene is captured, from the highlights all the way to the shadows. It can take 2 photos, it can take 3 or 4 photos depending on if you're shooting into the sun, and this is definitely a must-learn skill. Now, with the tools we have, it's usually just a few clicks and you can blend multiple exposures in Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever post-processing software you use. Some cameras even have HDR functions built in that you can do all of this without even having to touch any software. So you don't have to learn some of these harder techniques in Photoshop like luminosity masking or selections. You can always use grad filters too if you want to carry those heavy sets around. I know what you're thinking, Mike, these tips are amazing and I cannot wait to put them to use out in the field. But you mentioned some apps in here that I really don't know much about and I'd love to know more. If you just click on this video right here, I will take you to my favorite photography apps that I use almost every time I go out shooting. So as always, thank you guys so much for watching and we'll see you in the next video. Bye.